Good morning, everyone. I first want to thank Reverend Brett for inviting me to speak today, and I want to thank all of you for welcoming here and allowing me to speak on your bema, as we would say at Temple, on your pulpit. I want to share a story first of Reverend Brent. We came to Worcester close to the same time, about a year and a half apart, and one of my congregants sent me an article about him because he was from Mississippi, and she knew that I had lived there. So I think we first met at a rally in Worcester before we actually had a chance to have lunch together, and we started talking about those Mississippi connections, and there was just an instant moment, as Southerners often have when stranded together in Arctic New England. And just as a little aside, as we were talking, we discovered that we had a connection in Dallas. I had worked there for a little bit, and Waco, which was very odd. Right outside of Waco, I had met my husband, Jonathan, at a camp, a Jewish camp. And then I said to him, now you're going to tell me that you did something in Merritt Island, where I grew up, Merritt Island, Florida. And yes, he had. All right. So many of you are probably aware that anti-Semitism has been rising over a number of years. And actually, that's not quite the right statement. Cases of anti-Semitism and hate crimes against Jews in America, that's what's been rising. And in the past few years, they have surged. People's feelings and attitudes are hard to measure, but actions are measurable. And that's the only way we can measure them. So we don't know if people's attitudes related to Jews that are anti-Semitic have been rising, or if they've always been there. We are living in a very frightening time, not just for Jews, of course, but for people of other religions as well. A dangerous and impossible time for our immigrant neighbors, and for people who fall into someone else's category of different. So I'm going to speak from my perspective as a Jew about anti-Semitism, but what I have to say applies to all communities at risk. I was recently surprised, even as someone who follows these issues, to see the statistics showing that compared to people of any other religious affiliation in our country, that there are more hate crimes against Jews. Some of you may have heard about what happened at Beth Israel Congregation in Jackson, Mississippi, about 3 weeks ago. A young man committed arson and destroyed part of the building, including the library and the office area. Now, most importantly, no one was hurt, thank God. But in the library, 2 Torah scrolls were burned completely to ash, along with prayer books and other holy artifacts. The Torah scrolls in the sanctuary were damaged, and the hope is that they can be restored. The only scroll left untouched, the scroll recovered from the Holocaust, which was displayed in a glass case. It didn't take long for the police and the FBI to determine that this was a hate crime based on the perpetrator's social media, text messages, and his own confession. So I bring up this incident for 2 reasons. First, Beth Israel was my former congregation, the one I served right before coming to Worcester, and it remains very close to my heart. I had just been there the week before the fire, officiating at the wedding of a former bar mitzvah student. He was grown up by now. But the second reason is to talk about the community's response, the greater community's response in Jackson, especially the response of churches and other houses of worship. Almost immediately after the news broke, religious leaders reached out to Beth Israel to offer words of comfort, love, and solidarity, as well as something very practical, a space for worship and whatever infrastructure might be needed as the congregation figured out what came next. The mayor and the fire chief both spoke beautifully and essentially said, "Not in our city. We do not accept this against anyone." The unconditional support for the synagogue from surrounding religious communities is a model for all of us. Whenever any person or group is threatened, there is real strength and power when the interfaith community gathers around a shared moral purpose. This week's Torah portion, as you've heard already, is called Yitro, or in English, Jethro. A Torah portion is a section of the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures that Jews read each week, beginning on Sunday and concluding on Shabbat on Saturday. You might call it our lectionary. Jethro is Moses' father-in-law, a Midianite. It is unusual for a Torah portion to be named after a person. There are only 6 of those in all of our Torah portions, and even more unusual for one to be named after a non-Israelite. There are only 3. And Jethro, or Yitro in Hebrew, is one of them. For me, there's already something meaningful here. When I read the portion through a modern interpretive lens, is this interfaith cooperation in the ancient world? Maybe not the way we would define it today, but for me, yes. In this portion, Moses is exhausted. He's overwhelmed by the impossible task of judging every dispute among the Israelites. He has no more bandwidth for anything, but keeps moving forward. Jethro sees this and tells him very directly that what he is doing is unsustainable. He urges Moses to delegate the smaller cases to trusted leaders and reserve his energy for the most significant matters. This allows Moses to become the visionary, the big picture leader that the people actually need. The story contains an important leadership lesson for all of us. But it isn't what the portion is most famous for. Later in the same portion, we encounter the giving of the 10 Commandments, which Judaism sometimes call the 10 utterances. The Torah and later rabbinic interpretations describe this moment as deeply intimate. Each Israelite hears God's voice in a way they are uniquely able to receive it. It is as if the divine speaks directly into each person's mind and heart and soul, that if they hear God's voice speaking to them alone. The tradition describes this as Shekhinah, God's indwelling presence, dwelling among them. So in good traditional rabbinic fashion, I couldn't resist connecting these 2 moments of Jethro giving advice and the 10 Commandments. What if the Torah is teaching that when people of different backgrounds and beliefs come together to solve a problem, they make space for Shekhinah, for God's presence, to enter the world? Would the 10 Commandments have been revealed in the same way if Jethro and Moses had not worked together? Would each person have experienced revelation so personally if Moses had not learned to share power and trust others? Maybe, but maybe not. Our tradition consistently teaches that when people gather with intention around what truly matters, Shekhinah, God's presence, is drawn into their midst. In Talmud, a famous text in Judaism, Talmud teaches that when 10 people pray together, the Shekhinah is present. And even when 3 people sit together in judgment, the Shekhinah is also there. And when two people study Torah together, the Shekhinah dwells between them. The tradition emphasizes an escalating intimacy. God's presence does not require grand numbers or even perfect conditions. Even 2 people gathered with intention are enough to bring God's presence. A rabbinic reading of Leviticus chapter 16, verse 16, pushes this idea even further, teaching that the Shekhinah dwells among the people even in their impurity. We know that Leviticus is all about purity and impurity. Sometimes we think it has nothing to teach us, but actually it does, deep in the text. So in that section, Shekhinah dwelling among people even in their impurity, it becomes a cornerstone, especially of later Jewish theology. God's presence does not abandon us when we fail, when we are broken, or when we fall short. We see that further in another section in Talmud, that wherever Israel was exiled, the Shekhinah went with them, into Egypt, into Babylonia, into every displacement. This is a theological earthquake. God is not only transcendent and above history, God is displaced with the displaced. Lurianic Kabbalah, this is a kind of mysticism, takes this even deeper. It teaches that Shekhinah was scattered with the shattering of the vessels, and that each ethical act gathers divine sparks back together. With each good thing we do, it's as if we bring God back together. Community itself becomes a site of tikkun, the site of repair, that when we gather, we're able to repair the world. In the modern era, Abraham Joshua Heschel taught that God's presence is found in human concern and moral response. The Shekhinah dwells wherever people refuse to be indifferent. To me, that sums up all of it. And Abraham Joshua Heschel is famous for marching in Selma, among his other actions with civil rights, that God's presence is with us whenever we refuse to be indifferent. Take in all of these teachings together, it tells us that Shekhinah, God's presence, dwells among people, not places. Divine presence emerges through relationships, study, prayer, ethical action, shared vulnerability, and shared responsibility. God goes into exile with the community, and holiness is something that we co-create. So what does that look like for us today? For Beth Israel congregation in Mississippi, it meant that their first service after their fire was held at Northminster Baptist Church. It's not exactly the same denomination as American Baptist. They're called Cooperative Baptist, but Reverend Brent just told me that they're not Southern Baptist. So it makes them the same. And not only that, there's a beautiful picture of the sanctuary Torah scrolls being unrolled in, I think, the fellowship hall on tables in Northminster to air out. The two congregations, just like our congregations, had a long relationship from decades earlier. Northminster had worshiped at Beth Israel while constructing their own building. There's this beautiful video of a woman who describes going to church when she was very little at Beth Israel, going to church at synagogue. And she says, would I be so committed to rights of others? And she was wearing a t-shirt that talked about immigrant rights. Would I be so concerned about civil rights if it wasn't for my time at Beth Israel? And she said, maybe I would because of my lifelong involvement with Northminster. But she said, I don't think so. I don't think it would have been as ingrained in me if I hadn't had that time at the synagogue. So the Shabbat that happened right after the fire, surrounded both by Beth Israel and Northminster families, that's where Beth Israel had their first service, at Northminster. Tamar Sharp, a longtime member of the congregation, celebrated becoming a bat mitzvah as an adult. It was already scheduled, of course they were going to have it, and Northminster welcomed them with open arms, and both members of both communities celebrated with her. At the conclusion of her Devar Torah, her teaching of the Torah portion, this is what she shared. How lucky am I to be in one of my favorite places, surrounded by my favorite people. So much has changed in the 2 weeks since I wrote these words. Her mother had also died on December 31st, so this was just a little over 2 weeks later. And she wrote, and yet today I can say how lucky I am, and how lucky is our congregation to be welcomed by Northminster Church, to have a temporary home as we rebuild and heal. She said, the greater Jackson community has been incredibly loving and supportive during this difficult time. She then recalled an English prayer that is often recited at Shabbat services, that is also recited at Temple Emmanuel Sinai in our prayer book, Mishkan Tefillah. And this prayer says, standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we were taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it is eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hands and marching together. I don't know exactly what it would look like in Worcester for us to do a better job of joining hands and marching together. I just know that if we did, we would make a greater difference in repairing the world and bringing the divine presence into our midst. Perhaps this is a charge that one of you will pick up and the rest of us will follow, because just like Jethro, I know how to delegate. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will and our own. Amen.